In this, the week we remember those who died in World War II, I've come to Delaware in the United States for a special edition of Political Thinking, at the start of a new series of conversations with, rather than newsy interrogations of, those who shape our political thinking about what has shaped theirs. My guest this week is the last living president of this country to have been born during the Second World War, a man who says it shaped his beliefs and his values, a man who served for 50 years as a frontline politician, as senator for this state, as vice president to Barack Obama, and then president of the United States. On this special anniversary, we invited President Joe Biden to reflect on the history and what it teaches us now.
Good to see you.
Real pleasure to meet you.
It's an honor to have you here.
I'm told you know this place.
I know this place. Yep, it's the Hotel DuPont. And this was the center of all activity in this town for a long, long time.
And am I right, you launched your senatorial campaign in this building?
I did, in the main hall downstairs.
Please come and take it.
Viewed almost as sacrilegious,
Yeah.
a young Democrat coming to Republican territory to announce, but no.
That was what, just 50 years ago?
That's all.
Not a
It was
lot.
yesterday.
Mr. President, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thanks for being here.
In this week of celebrations of VE Day, I've been looking back at a speech you made a year ago at Normandy for the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And you said, they knew beyond any doubt there are things worth fighting and dying for. It's a message of sacrifice. Do you fear that that message is being forgotten in America right now?
I do fear a little bit. And I don't think it's been forgotten by the people. I think it's being forgotten by the leadership a little bit. Excuse my cough. The fact is that my father and mother's generation knew what was at stake. They knew that that democracy was literally hanging in the balance. Adolf Hitler, had he won, had there been no united Europe and united with the United States, you know, the United States has never been able to avoid a war in Europe. And so one of the smartest things we did after World War II was we formed NATO, because alliances provide security. And imagine had we not done that. So, and the other thing, I'd been to a landing on D-Day, a reenactment of that event, on the 80th earlier. And coming in one of those boats, those landing craft, and the thousands of ships were out there, and the tens of thousands of men and women, mostly men, who stormed the beaches. And then how they scale those cliffs. You know, there's 6,000 grave sites there. 6,000.
That's what's in your mind on this week.
And you know, anyway, I just, the world has gotten smaller. And so imagine if we didn't have NATO now, what would be happening in the Mediterranean? What would be happening with regard to activity by Russia and China in the region? But NATO is the strongest alliance in the history of the world.
You say imagine. Can you imagine it now? Because there are some people who fear that this Atlantic alliance, born in the Second World War, is now dying before our very eyes. Is that your concern?
It's a grave concern. I think it would change the modern history of the world if that occurs. Look, we are not the essential nation, but we're the only nation in a position to have the capacity to bring people together to lead the world. Otherwise, you're going to have China and the former Soviet Union, Russia, stepping up. And when I say inflection point, there's so much change taking place so rapidly that there needs to be an ability to respond rapidly. And I just think to myself, what would have happened in the Middle East, as bad as things are now, were there no NATO, do you think Russia and China would have stayed out militarily? I don't, anyway.
At the centre of NATO is this promise, isn't it? You called it in a speech I saw in Warsaw a few years ago, a sacred obligation, which
is sacred.
You defend each other. Do you think
Attack
Donald...
on one is an attack on all.
Do you believe that obligation is still respected by Donald Trump?
Well, he doesn't say it is. And I think the rest of the world, I know, one of the only advantages of being the old guy is that I've known every major world leader in the last 30 years, and I've known them personally. And I know all the major world leaders today. And I can tell you, the last meeting of the G7 meeting, the NATO 7, anyway, or the G20, which is a larger group. As we left the meeting, almost every world leader would pull me aside and say, we got to keep NATO. My democracy is at stake. Every generation has to fight to maintain democracy. Everyone. Everyone's going to be challenged. And we've done it well for the last 80 years, and I'm worried that there's a loss of understanding of the consequence of that.
You've talked about a great threat to democracy. Do you really believe that there is a greater threat now to democracy than at any time since the Second World War?
Yes, I do. Because, I mean, look at the number of European leaders in European countries. They're wondering, well, what do I do now? I mean, what's the best route for me to take? Can I rely on the United States? Are they going to be there? Not alone in the United States. Will this stay together? And, you know, and instead of democracies expanding around the world, they're receding. And democracy is, every generation has to fight for it.
And yet you hear what's being said by this administration. The Vice President, J.D. Vance, complains about European freeloading, he calls it. The Defence Secretary, let me just repeat that. You know what they're saying in this administration. The US Defence Secretary talks about European freeloading. The Vice President talks about your country, the United States, bailing out Europe. There's an anger there. Have they not got a point?
No, they don't have a point. Look, you have of all the NATO nations, almost all of them are 2% right now. But what they've done is, you know, when we were attacked, what happened on 9/11? They all responded, support us. Look, imagine there being no NATO. Do you think Putin would have stopped at Ukraine? Do we think Putin would have stopped I don't understand how they fail to understand that there's strength in alliances. There's benefits. The cost there, it saves us money overall.
Let's turn to Ukraine, can we? Because you compared the war in Ukraine with the Second World War. President Trump is now saying, look, if you want peace, Ukraine is going to have to give up some territory. Some people think that is common sense to say that. Do you think it's not common sense? It's perhaps modern-day appeasement?
It is modern-day appeasement. Look, listen to what Putin said when he talked about going from Kyiv into Ukraine and why. He believes it's part of Mother Russia. He believes it's a historical right to Ukraine. He talks about Eastern Europe. What this man wants to do is reestablish the Warsaw Pact. He can't stand the fact that the Russian dictatorship that he runs, that the Soviet Union has collapsed. And anybody thinks he's going to stop is just foolish. And look, we have $1 trillion economies with economic exchanges with Europe. I just don't understand how people think that if we allow a dictator, a thug, to decide he's going to take significant portions of land that aren't his, and that's going to satisfy him, I don't quite understand.
So you call it appeasement. What might happen if the Trump administration says, look, that's the deal. You've got to give this territory up, at least temporarily. What is your fear of the consequence of that?
My fear of the consequence is that some of the NATO countries are going to decide that maybe, especially those along the border with Russia, may just say, we got to make an accommodation. We got to make an accommodation. We got to give Russia more space. We got to go on. We have to yield to the pressures, whether they're economic, political, or military. And
so you see countries like Romania, for example, having a presidential election, choosing people who are Putin's friends.
I don't even want to say it. Yeah, I worry about it.
What did you make of those scenes in the Oval Office? President Trump and President Zelensky?
I found it sort of beneath America, the way that took place. And the way we talk about now that, well, it's the Gulf of America. Maybe we're going to have to take back Panama. Maybe we need to acquire Greenland. Maybe Canada should be. What the hell's going on here? What president ever talks like that? That's not who we are. We're about freedom, democracy, opportunity, not about confiscation.
Does that mean, do you think, that talk destroys the alliances that
Sure it does.
the United States have depended on?
Whether it destroys it, it weakens it considerably. Weakens it considerably. I mean, Canada, the way we talk about Canada, it's like as if it could be a 51st state. Canada's been an ally. Look, we have a significant advantage. One of the reasons why we thought it was important to be a thing called NATO. We had the Pacific Ocean and Atlantic Ocean on our east and our west, Canada and Mexico on our north and our south. What does Britain have? What is all France? What are they surrounded by? They're surrounded by countries that have been in war off and on for the last 500 years. And NATO brought stability.
But you will know what they sometimes say of you, sir. They sometimes say, look, President Biden warned us about this invasion of Ukraine. He did. He led the West in standing up to Putin. He did that. But they sometimes say that you didn't have the courage to go all the way to let Ukraine win. You let them stop the invasion, but you didn't give them the weapons they needed, the long-range weapons, to really win.
Well, a few people do say that, but the idea that they could win without engaging NATO in war, NATO having engaged the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, Russia, is not likely. We gave them everything they needed to provide for their independence, and we were prepared to respond more aggressively if, in fact, Putin moved again. But we needed to this is a tricky thing. You know, we had Poland now. Poland's, a NATO country. You know, Poland used to be in a situation where it was part of the Warsaw Pact. There's just a lot of change taking place. And the idea that we're ready to go to World War III with two nuclear powers could be avoided. And we did avoid it, but we also made...
That was the threat, though. That was the worry in your mind.
Yes. Well, look...
Go too hard against Russia.
Well,
nuclear weapons are used.
Go too hard against Russian territory, yes. Up to now, it wasn't involving Russian territory. And, what did Putin do when things got really tough for him? Threaten the use of tactical nuclear weapons. This is not a game of roulette.
It's a frightening time. Now, I can tell how angry you are, I think, with some of the things that your successor, with Donald Trump, has been saying and doing. You say it's not who we are, it's not America. The other day you said in a speech, nobody is king. Do you think he's behaving more like a monarch than a president?
Oh, I'd rather not comment. I'm not sure how he's behaving. He's not behaving like a Republican president.
You're being diplomatic, sir. What do you say about his 100 days? Now, he says, look at all these things I've achieved. I've closed the border. I've started to bring jobs back to the United States. I'm cutting government waste. He says he's delivering what people voted for.
Let me tell you, when I left office, we had created more jobs than any president in history of the United States in one term. Our economy was roaring. We were moving in a direction where the stock market was way up. We're in a situation where we were expanding our influence around the world in a positive way, increasing trade. We regained control of what we invented, the control of the future of computer chips, which control everything. We were in a situation where there was growth, opportunity, and we, for example, they told me remember Trump had this plan, he was gonna, rebuild America, increase our infrastructure. We had Infrastructure Week for 4 years, nothing was built. I was able to convince the Congress and the American people to accept $1.3 trillion in economic growth.
So he says his 100 days is a triumph. What does President Biden say about Trump's first 100 days?
I'll let history judge that. I don't see anything that was triumphant.
And you see things to worry about. Do you, when you talk of a threat to democracy, worry about a threat to democracy here at home, here in the United States?
I'm less concerned about that than I was, because I think the Republican Party is waking up to what Trump is about.
Do you think they may fight back?
I think the beginning, yes.
But you will know people see laws apparently being broken, courts ignored, Congress sidelined. They don't like what they see.
Well, I think they're seeing that too. I think that's why I don't think he'll succeed in that effort.
Let's return to where we began our conversation. You have this powerful phrase about an inflection point. You said once that we're living through a dramatic change in the world of the sort that you only see every, 6 or 8 generations. Young people are very frightened at the moment. I think possibly more frightened than any time I can remember in my lifetime. Are they right to be?
They're right to be concerned. That's why they have to be involved. They have to be involved. They have to get engaged. They have to be part of the political process. They have to vote. They have to make sure they make their views known. And I think it's I think it may be also a wake-up call to that generation. There's look, think about this. The idea the United States is deciding to significantly reduce its work in terms of technical advancements. Look, how can you remain the most powerful nation in the world and have a second-rate infrastructure? How can you maintain those powerful the nation in the world with a second-rate education system? How can you be the most powerful nation in the world if you don't have the ability to provide opportunity for a vast majority of the American people? Look, my dad used to have an expression. He'd say, look, Joey, everybody in America deserves a shot. It's a shot. It's a shot. That's why I changed the economic model. We talk about, instead of trickle-down economics, as my dad would say, not a whole lot trickled down to his kitchen table. But I tell you what, we grew the economy from the middle out and the bottom up. I focused on that. The wealthy still doing very well. They got to start paying their taxes a little more, number one. But number two, the middle class is growing.
Hope is a word that you've often liked to use. Hope instead of fear. And when you moved into the Oval Office, up on the wall there was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who talked about the triumph of hope over fear. He was, of course, America's wartime leader. Do you fear that the America that we've seen ever since that time is ending? The Atlantic Alliance we've seen ever since that time?
No, here's what I fear. I fear that our allies around the world are going to begin to doubt whether we're going to stay where we've always been the last 80 years. For example, when we had the first G7 meeting, that is the leaders of the European nations in England, hosted by your government, we sat down the first meeting, I think it was in February, of my first year. And I sat there and I looked and I said, America's back. And Manuel looked at me and said, for how long? For how long? I take some responsibility and credit for rebuilding NATO. We added 2 significant powers to the NATO. 10 days before Dr. Kissinger died, he called me. And he said, not since Napoleon has Paris not looked over its shoulder at Moscow with a feeling of dread till you came along. NATO is stronger. They can't do that. They know. And so, in the meantime, I still remember what Manuel said. He said, for how long? Now, here we are. We did all that. And in 4 years, we got a guy who wants to walk away from it all. I'm worried that Europe's going to lose confidence in the certainty of America and the leadership of America in the world to deal with not only NATO, but other matters that have a consequence. Look, what do? I was able to put together AUKUS. That is an alliance in Asia, Australia, Japan, the United States, India. I mean, the idea that we're in a situation where we've moved in a direction that, for example, in Africa, Africa is going to have 50% of the world's population. 50% of the world's population, I think, is by 2080.
I can hear your passion. I can hear your anxiety that the world is changing the way it has. And for a long time you believed, you said, I'm the man who can stop Donald Trump. And you did once. And in the end, you withdrew from that election campaign at the last minute. It's a question you know lots of people ask you, Mr. President. Did you leave it too late? Should you have withdrawn earlier, given someone else a bigger chance?
I don't think it would have mattered. We left at a time when we had a good candidate. She was fully funded. And what happened was, I had become, what we had set out to do, no one thought we could do. And it become so successful on our agenda, it was hard to say, no, I'm going to stop now. I meant what I said when I started, that I think I'm prepared to hand this to the next generation. It's a transition government. But things moved so quickly that it made it difficult to walk away, and it was a hard decision, but.
Regrets, though?
No, I think it was the right decision. I think that well, it was just a difficult decision.
But you shouldn't have taken it earlier.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I don't know how that would have made much difference.
I want to thank you for giving us this interview on VE Day and give you a chance just to reflect finally a little bit about the people you've met over the years, because you were telling me when I first met you about the veterans that you've met last year in Normandy when you went for the 80th anniversary of D-Day.
They're an incredible generation, and they're fading out. I sat with them, and they talked about how much it mattered to them, what they were proud that they had stopped this fascism, what they had done. You know, I was in the cemetery two years before when I went over to Normandy, and I was walking through the graveyards. The graveyard are meticulously kept in the American cemetery, and thousands of dead Americans. And I looked, and I knelt down, and I thought I saw, and there was 2 crosses next to one another, the father and the son. I thought, my God. I was not kneeling, but squatted down. And all of a sudden I heard behind me, "Change up." I turned around, there was a gentleman with a VFW hat on, a veteran's hat on, and he saluted me. He said, "Mr. President," I saluted him. I said, "Thank you. Thank you for what you did." And he put his hand on his wife's shoulder and said, "No, no, thank her, she did it." And I looked at him and he said, she was part of the effort. She built the ships that got us here. She stepped up. The entire generation of women of our country stepped up. He said, "I'm so proud of her. I'm so proud of her." The men and women I met knew when they got off those landing craft, when they came into those gliders, that they were as likely to die as live. And they did it. They did it anyway, because they felt it was worth dying for if need be. They had to stop this maniac, Hitler. They had to maintain democracy. And they're willing to give their lives to do it. An incredible, incredible, incredible generation.
And finally, this is about values as well, isn't it?
It sure is.
You've talked very movingly about your late son, Bo, who served in Iraq, and said that in many ways the values he embodied were like the values embodied by the wartime generation. Is that the plea that you want to make for those values to be maintained in your country?
It is. Look, my son was a good man. And my dad used to have a saying. He said, "Look, Joey, everyone's entitled to be treated with dignity, no matter who they are, no matter where they're from." And my son ran for Attorney General and won. And he was a likely candidate for governor. He was offered the Senate seat, and he turned it down because he didn't want to be given the Senate seat, appointed. And one day I came home on a Friday, and I came home and I got a call on a Monday. He said, "What are you doing Friday, Dad?" And I said, "No, what do you need?" He said, "I want you to pin my bars on." I said, "Pin your bars on? You're married, you have two, what do you, I joined the National Guard. I think I have an obligation as an Attorney General." When his unit got sent to Iraq, he decided he had to go with them. They wouldn't let him go because you're either state property or federal property. If you're National Guard, you're the state. So he decided that, so I didn't understand why he kept coming to Washington. He was able to work it out so he would give up his Attorney General's job while he was in the National Guard, and he went to Iraq for a year because he thought it was his duty to do so. Unfortunately, he lived not very far from a burn pit, and he acquired stage 4 glioblastoma, more brain disease than anyway, and he died.
This VE Day, your minds are on, finally, the values of people like your son and people like you met in Normandy.
And I still think that the values the vast majority of the American people value. Do everything we can to avoid war, but not yield to tyrants. Not yield.
President Biden, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
It's clear that the passion which drove Joe Biden into politics in this magnificent hotel in Wilmington in Delaware is undimmed. Clear, too, that the belief of the man who was born in the Second World War in the importance of the Atlantic Alliance is undiminished. Perhaps that's one explanation for why he ignored for so long those who were saying he needed to withdraw from the race against Donald Trump. He and others are now left to reflect whether a different decision would have made any difference. I sense that he believes that we are, though, at what he calls an inflection point, a once in 5 or 6 generation moment of change, a change that means pretty much everything he's taken for granted for his whole adult life will now be different. That's it from this edition of Political Thinking. Thank you for watching.